Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us, and thank you online as well. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs with the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, here at Georgetown University. Today, we're going to be discussing the extent to which the U.S. capital flows from the United States and other U.S. entities to China in their technological space, and particularly in AI, are having an effect on China's ambitions in AI, and what can be done from a policy perspective to control those capital flows. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. We are holding this seminar in hybrid format with folks here in the room as well as online. And for those online, if you experience any technical difficulties, please put a question in the chat and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. We'll come back to it during the Q&A portion of the program. And now it's time to turn the mic over to our moderator. Emily Kilcrease is a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, or CNAS. Her research focuses on the US-China economic relationship, alignment of national security objectives and economic policy, and geoeconomic statecraft. She previously served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR, overseeing the development, negotiation, and coordination of U.S. foreign investment policy. She served as the Senior Career Staffer leading the USTR's work on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, and coordinated USTR policy engagement on related national security and economic tools, including export controls and supply chain risk management. Previously, she served on the staff of the National Security Council as a director for international trade, investment, and development. Prior to the NSC, she served at the Department of Commerce, overseeing the department's CFIUS work. She began her government service at the Department of Interior, working on trade and environment policy. And I'd like to take the opportunity in this place and time to note that in order to prepare for her public service and public policy career, Emily Kilcrease, like our two presenters today, studied at Georgetown University. Emily, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. And indeed, it is nice to be back at Georgetown. And thank you to CSET for hosting this event. I'm delighted to be here for this important conversation on outbound investment. We've been talking about outbound investment in DC policy circles for a number of years, perhaps even dating back to 2018 when Congress had the wisdom to reform our inbound investment screening and export control regimes. But despite the fact that this has been an issue that we've been considering for quite some time, it has remained difficult to ground the policy debate in hard facts. And so the report that we're going to be discussing today from Emily Weinstein and Ngor Luong, two excellent CSET researchers, is an incredibly important contribution to this debate. We're able to take this theoretical conversation and move it from theory to actually concrete solutions based on an assessment of transactions that we're actually seeing in the wild in one particular sector that's incredibly important for US-China strategic competition. And of course, that is artificial intelligence. As the authors of the report duly note, there remains much work to be done, even after their excellent report, in terms of making policy decisions to scope an outbound investment mechanism, implementing it, administering it, thinking about unintended consequences, and how the US can retain benefits from integration with China's AI ecosystem. No easy questions here. Thank you, Emily and Ngor, for your excellent work to move the debate forward, and over to you to present your findings.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. And we're going to be playing the which Emily are we referring to game here a little bit today, so bear with us. But I'm going to go ahead and get our slides up and kick us off. So thank you all for being here. My name is Emily Weinstein. Again, I'm a research fellow here at CSET. And Ngor and I are super excited to be here today with all of you to discuss our recent report that tries to assess the scope, scale, and nature of U.S. investment in Chinese AI companies. So today's presentation is only going to kind of touch the surface of the entire report, which for those who grabbed one on the way in is thicker than Ngor and I probably expected when we first started the report or started the research process. But again, we're going to try to highlight some of the key findings for any potential U.S. outbound investment policy regime review, anything like that. So again, this is what we'll be covering today, and happy to go into more details in the Q&A if things do come up. So to get us started, I know Emily hinted a little bit at this in her introductory statements, but why are we having this conversation? The main driver really has been a notice on the part of the US government that China is making massive investments in artificial intelligence. And this is both investments in terms of dollar amounts, in terms of money, but also in terms of talent, R&D, so on and so forth. They're really digging in. They've really been digging into this since 2017, but even earlier than that as well. And the US government, and I would say we're not alone in noticing this, other allies and partners have been noticing this as well, that as China's been making these massive investments, we have been grappling with how to deal with them. So both the administration, and I would say the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, as well as folks in Congress, have really emphasized artificial intelligence as an important aspect in US-China tech competition. It is not the only facet of this competition, but it is often breathed in the same sentence as US-China tech competition. So we thought it would be really important to dig into artificial intelligence as a starting point. And so as we're thinking about mechanisms to deal with China's massive investments in AI, there have been lots of policy mechanisms or levers that have been really key to the debate here. And one of them, obviously, one of these big policy debates has been mechanisms for regulating tech-related investment flows. This was really big in 2017, 2018 with the passage of FIRMA. But now, again, the conversation about outbound investment has come back. So here we are. And this project started around end of 2021 and 2022 when Ngor and I sat down and said, hey, this is really interesting, but there is a kind of a data and evidence gap that we wanted to try and fill with CSET data. So before we dive into the kind of nitty-gritty of the data here, I really want to emphasize kind of two key findings and then one really important policy implication here. When doing our research project here, we found that Chinese investors remain the dominant investors in Chinese AI companies. And Nora will go more into the numbers on that in just a moment. But nonetheless, US investors are likely providing their Chinese portfolio companies with intangible benefits, things like mentorship, coaching, networking opportunities, name recognition, so on. And so we'll talk a little bit more and provide some actual examples of that in action in just a bit. But lastly, this one policy implication is this idea that the US government is not currently in a position to effectively measure, monitor, or regulate outbound investment flows into Chinese AI companies. So because of this, we will come to some policy recommendations towards the end, but let's pass it over to Nor to talk a bit about our data.
Thanks, Emily. And before we get to the policy conversation, we thought that it's really important to first talk about the AI investment landscape in China. And to help us understand this, we use Crunchbase, which is a financial data provider. And we use it to follow the money and to also analyze the scope, the scale, the nature of AI investment in China between 2015 and 2021. And I can get into the methodology a bit later in the Q&A if folks here are interested in that. But I'll say one thing here that our data science team here at CSET has worked a lot and helped us curate the data for the purpose of this paper. And the resulting data tells us that China has the world's second largest AI investment market. And for context as well, the US has the world's largest AI investment market. So the Chinese one trails behind the US. And with that fact, the fact that China has a robust AI investment market, also the fact that its private equity and venture capital industry is also growing substantially. It's not really surprising that we're seeing that Chinese investors are the one dominating its own AI investment market. And so, on the flip side of this, we see that in this figure that the US is not dominating in China's AI investment market. Here, you see that the US only plays a small part, only a small share of investment in the whole China's ecosystem. And I also want to point out to the first part of the figure, which shows the number of AI investment transactions. And here you can see that about 1 out of 5 investment transactions involved at least one US investor. And we can also zoom in a little on the second bar chart to kind of take a look at the different groups of investors that has US present as well. So US investors is present in that, in these categories. And I want to highlight the red bar that says US investors. Here, it's really important to take a look at this portion of investment because if we, tomorrow we snap our fingers and say, all right, we're going to eliminate all US capital flowing to Chinese AI market. This is the portion of investment that is most likely going to be impacted, right? So I really want to emphasize that fact. But also what's interesting here as well is the fact that when investors put down money, they don't typically go at it alone, right? They do it with other investors. So here you see that US investors also jointly invest with Chinese investors, so the blue bar, as well as in other instances, we see them doing that with other foreign investors. So we're talking about South Korean, Japanese investors. And that being said, we can also take a look at the money portion of that. So the second part of this figure here, the money is absolutely important, right? We need to track that. But I also want to emphasize the fact that we cannot isolate the exact amount of money that is coming from all US investors that have a stake or have participation in that transaction alone. And so one key takeaway from this part of the report is that about 40% or so of the value that Chinese AI companies have raised from funders has US participation in that. And so it's not really enough to look at the size of investment. We really need to know where exactly the money is going in the AI space. So I'll hand over to Emily to talk about that.
Perfect. So see if I can remember how to use technology. So in terms of Ngor has laid out the kind of broad scale of what we looked at here. But the most important thing to remember, again, we're looking at AI companies, but it's super important to remember that AI itself is not a sector, but AI has many applications across different sectors. We like to say kind of AI is like a building block per se, and it powers numerous diverse sectors. So knowing that this was something that, knowing that this was a question that Nora and I were going to get, we tried to look back and talk to folks on the CSET data team and see how could we actually go one step lower? How could we think about subsectors of AI? So what we did was we pulled on a previous CSET taxonomy called TINA that we cover more in the appendix of our report. But what we did here is we used the TINA taxonomy to go through and actually identify those subsectors of artificial intelligence. And that's the chart that you all can see here. So we've got a wide range of AI applications here, ranging from general purpose, which is that biggest category. And for those who are interested, general purpose is anything from computing hardware, cloud computing, robotics, kind of AI that is being used for the purposes of efficiency or speeding something up, or is just, again, that building block to something else. But then we've got examples of AI being used in other kind of more specific contexts. So again, in transportation, that's anything from avionics to drones to autonomous vehicles, all the way down to consumer goods, AI education software, so on. For those who are interested, we do have that one very interesting military one at the bottom, and it's military, public safety, and government. And this is the way that the taxonomy was built to kind of have this category of entities that either work closely with the military, the government, or the public safety industry. And we do have one company there that is a Chinese AI company that works on kind of smart city surveillance type technologies. For the most part, though, the question that Nora and I would always get is this idea of, okay, so you have this list of AI companies. How do we know what's more risky than others, or where are kind of the highest risk investments going? And we kind of like to point to the fact that, look, we only have one that is very obviously a surveillance military type company, honestly, anything artificial intelligence nowadays, someone can make the argument that it has dual use applications. And the one is kind of funny example from our report is an example of a Chinese AI company that was invested in by Disney. That is a Chinese AI company working on animatronic related technologies. And I said this to someone kind of in a crass, offhanded comment, and they said, "Well, no. Animatronics like this, the AI that's behind that could have military implications." I said, okay, well then if Disney is investing in this animatronics company and that company has, is working on technology that has military applications, then yeah, I think it's fair to say that almost everything in our data set is probably dual use. So the question comes down to now, how do you assess risk? And we'll talk a little bit about this more in kind of the policy recommendations later. But in this case, we have to start thinking about risk associated with emerging technologies as existing on a spectrum, knowing that there's not going to be anything that has no risk, especially when we're talking about Chinese AI companies. You're always going to have to take on some amount of risk in investing in a company and partnering with a company, joint ventures, research collaboration, but trying to then parse back to the actual end uses of that technology or end users or the company in this case. So again, kind of goes back to that export control lingo here a little bit, but super important to think about here. So we've talked a little bit about where the money is going in terms of the type of companies, but I'm going to pass it back to Nora to talk about where the money is going in terms of the nature of the investments.
Right. And really the biggest takeaway from this part is that a large portion of US investment targeting Chinese AI companies here was at the venture capital investment stages. And even so, at the earlier stages where you see, angels, seeds, pre-seed, series A and B. And, in terms of the money itself, for those of you who follow the space very closely, you're probably familiar with the fact that the amount of money raised at the earlier stages of investment is quite small, right? Because this kind of investment comes with a lot of risk. You don't really know exactly if the company you're investing in is going to be successful or not. So with that in mind, another context is that U.S. investors are not the only one focusing on earlier stage investment in China. This trend actually mirrors the overall trend that we see in China overall, meaning that Chinese investors or Chinese AI companies have generally raised a lot more money at the earlier stages rather than the private equity financing that you've also seen a figure here. But it's also really important for us to understand US venture capital investment in general, right? Because the US is really the one that have pioneered the venture capital model. And this kind of investment also really focuses on mentoring and funding startups that are at the stage where they still have to tweak their business models or have to refine their products before they commercialize even further or become even more mature. So what we kind of like going here is that we're past the point where we're only talking about money here, right? We're going beyond the money territory. It's not just about the money anymore. And we felt even a greater need to understand what else is attached to the flow of US capital going to China. And with that, I'll pass it back to Emily to kind of talk about the intangible benefits with real world implications and impacts that is attached to US investment.
Yeah, so this is where we get into, we're going to leave the data numbers behind a little bit and talk really about these intangible benefits. And when we say the term intangible benefits, we're referring to things like what you see listed here. So things that come alongside US dollars. So again, the mentorship coaching, the name recognition and the networking opportunities. And I'm going to share 3 anecdotes from our report that demonstrate a combination of these benefits, understanding that these aren't, there aren't specific examples of, a US investor just mentoring and coaching a Chinese AI company. They all kind of, blend together. So 3 anecdotes kind of grouped into 2 categories here. The first one on the mentorship and coaching side is we see that big VC firms often have certain types of classes or courses that they provide to portfolio companies. So we have one instance, of like a very traditional kind of venture capital firm. We have GGV Capital that has master classes on topics for their Chinese portfolio companies. And these classes bring together expertise from entities like Tsinghua University, Huawei, Alibaba, other big names in China. And they teach classes on things related to talent, organizational structure, overall company strategy, and so on. So that's kind of one side of the mentorship and coaching. The other piece that we touch on very briefly in the report is this the accelerator and incubator world in venture capital. And we do have a few examples in our report and on our data set of U.S. venture capital or U.S. Venture capital adjacent type incubators and accelerators, as well as incubators and accelerators that are attached to big corporate companies. So for instance, when I mentioned Disney, that came from Disney Accelerator, that investment example. And so that kind of feeds nice into the name recognition and networking opportunities categories. Because we did have one example of a company, a Chinese AI company called Raven Tech. That's just an AI software company. It doesn't do anything kind of super crazy. But what this company did was that it participated in 2 accelerator programs. One was the Microsoft Accelerator Program. The other was an accelerator called Y Combinator. For those who are really familiar with kind of Silicon Valley and the VC industry there, you'll know that Y Combinator is one of the most famous ones, and I think one of the oldest ones at this point in time. Y Combinator, also really important to note that it has a very low acceptance rate. So it's very, very hard to get into. And it's a very kind of elite group that do get selected to participate in that program. So again, Raven Tech gets training and investment from Y Combinator and Microsoft Accelerator. And then we see in 2017, Baidu actually acquired Raven Tech. So this is a great opportunity where you could argue that perhaps the name recognition that came with the fact that this tiny startup was backed by Microsoft and by Y Combinator, that could be a signal to Baidu that this is a good company to invest in. The last example that we'll talk about before we wrap up and move to policy recommendations is this idea of kind of Chinese AI companies really using their US investors, and I say using not in terms of necessarily taking advantage of, but using the US investors for both the name recognition and again, the networking opportunities that come with this. And so I'm going to talk briefly about a company called Horizon Robotics that is a Chinese, it is a Chinese AI company that specializes in AI chips for robots and autonomous vehicles. It received Series A funding led by Intel Capital back in 2017. So again, Intel Capital being the venture capital arm of Intel Corporation that everyone knows. And what we found actually in kind of the course of our studies here was that it seems as if Horizon Robotics, the investment that it received from Intel, may have helped the company actually better compete with Intel in the long term. So what happened was, so again, the Series A funding happened in 2017. And then from 2017 and kind of over the next 3-4 years, we saw Horizon Robotics constantly touting the fact that it was backed by Intel. It would put it in every announcement, every kind of press release. It would also highlight that it received backing from SK Hynix, and those who are familiar with SK Hynix, massive South Korean chip company, very big in the semiconductor industry as well. So they would often be, they would say, we're Horizon Robotics, we're backed by Intel Capital and SK Hynix and so on. And so that happened for a couple of years. And now about 2021, 2022, we started to notice that industry experts, folks who were really watching the autonomous vehicle space, started to refer to Horizon Robotics as a competitor to NVIDIA and a competitor to a company called Mobileye, which Mobileye is what was originally an Israeli company, and it was acquired by Intel, and it is now the arm of Intel that is doing specialized AI chips for autonomous vehicles. So we see here that, fast forward 6 years after the investment from Intel, we see that Horizon Robotics is now directly competing with Mobileye, with this part of Intel that is doing the same type of research, same type of technology. And there's a great quote that I want to also throw out that we saw from a few industry experts as well that actually would say that Horizon Robotics, and this was as of 2022, is potentially in the position to overtake international rivals like Intel and NVIDIA. So this is not us, as kind of political science, political economy folks taking a look at this. These are people that are actively taking a look at these companies and their technologies. And they think that this Chinese company is getting to the point that it can, really, really compete and really overtake US counterparts. So with that, what does this all mean for US policy? I'll pass it to Ngor to talk about the data.
Right. So we started the presentation telling you that we need more data. And now we're about to end it telling you that we need more data and better data as well. I need to emphasize the better part because we do find a lot of gaps in our existing data set. And this is not coming from the fact that we are an organization that really focuses on data-driven analysis. And you can certainly buy a lot more commercial data sets all you want. But really the issue here is that the data currently doesn't exist, data that we need to further inform discussion around this topic. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple of the gaps that we've seen as we've been doing this research for the past year or so. The first one is really, when I said, when we look at the total amount of money coming from the US, I cannot tell you how much exactly is coming from US investors, right? For example, in our report, we noted that, for example, a company, SenseTime, it raised money from 7 different investors. Maybe 4 from the US, 2 from China, 1 from Singapore, another 1 from the UK. But I can't tell you for certain how much exactly did the 3 US investors funded the company during that funding round. And the second point is that it's really hard for us to kind of know the original source of the capital itself, especially coming from the US, because mainly because of the fact that limited partner information is confidential oftentimes. And we also note in the report itself as well that, for example, if you have a venture capital company headquartered in the US, they may or may not be managing money that is raised from limited partners, say from UK or Singapore, or even from China, right? And there is no requirement to disclose this kind of information. So it's really hard for us to ascertain that. And the third point is that we do use company headquarters as a proxy for the source of US investment. But again, we also recognize the limitation of that. Headquarters may not reflect the ultimate source of capital for the reason I also just explained earlier. And lastly, this also means that the data that we use for the analysis here of US investment into Chinese AI companies excludes any China-based subsidiaries of US investors, right? For example, everyone heard about Sequoia Capital. It's located in Menlo Park. It has a bunch of subsidiaries and affiliates in China, but it's really unclear to us how the network of, between the US-based entities and the China-based companies, how they share information and how the money flows between these 2 entities. And so this leaves us here in this moment in time where we really do not have enough data to better inform the policy. And it's really important for us to do this right. And so we do have concrete recommendations that we've made in the paper. And I'll pass it over to Emily to kind of talk us through next steps for policymakers.
Again, just more data, but also better data. So as Ngor just said, we need more data, we need better data. So obviously our first recommendation here would have to do with collecting more data. So one of the things that we recommend in the paper is for the US government to devise some type of program for collecting data on US outbound investment into China. And this could be done in a way that protects business confidentiality. So this is, maybe done in a way that things just go to the relevant government departments who are involved in this process. We can talk about how it might be similar to something we've seen with CFIUS. But again, there is no way really for us to make to craft effective policy at this point in time without more data. So once we have more data, I think it's important also for us to identify clear policy objectives for any potential outbound investment review or regime program, mostly because there are so many different reasons why folks in government and outside of government are advocating for any type of outbound investment regime. We hear this come up in the context of US investors investing in human rights abuses or companies that are implicated in human rights abuses in Xinjiang. We see examples of US investors knowingly or unknowingly investing in companies that are involved in Chinese military modernization. We've seen outbound investment come up also in the context of supply chain resiliency issues. So in certain cases, for instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, well, I should say at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw issues related to maybe China hoarding PPE or other types of things, people were concerned about US investment going into those industries in China that were kind of preventing the US from gaining access to specific things that we needed. So again, all of this is to say there are so many different reasons why we might want this type of regime, but we need to make sure that when we are crafting it, we craft it in a way that is very targeted and very clear, so we don't kind of bleed things into each other. And I would say, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but there are also some of these policy objectives like the supply chain resiliency issue that maybe an outbound investment regime might help for a bit, or it might tackle one part of the issue, but it's not the full answer, and it will only solve half the problem. The last two recommendations that we have are things that I like to say can be done in the interim while this data is being collected, because everyone kind of turns to us and says, it's great that you want to collect data, but we want to do something now. So in the interim, there are two recommendations that we have that the US government could undertake. The first being finding a way to expand or revise the scope of a list that is under the Department of Treasury. It is the Chinese Military Industrial Complex Companies List, long name. I will call it the CMIC list, as others do. This is a list that was stood up at the beginning of the Biden administration. It currently has 68 Chinese entities on it, all that are listed there for being part of either the defense and materiel sectors in China or the surveillance sector. These are supposed to be publicly traded companies, although we will say there are some privately held companies on that list as well. But this is a list that actually has not even really been touched since it was created back in 2021. So I won't go too much into detail on kind of ways to revise and expand that, but I'm happy to go into depth on that during the Q&A. And I know Emily has some thoughts on that as well. The last one has to do with this idea that we have too many China lists in the US government right now. We have, like I said, the CMIC list, we have the NDAA DOD list, we have lists associated with the entity list in the Department of Commerce. Too many lists. Why don't all the lists talk to each other? So one of the things we thought about in this case is, okay, let's think about creating a mechanism to prevent US investment into Chinese companies that are on the entity list. So these are Chinese companies that the Department of Commerce has decided should not receive or should not be allowed to receive the export or US exports of technology, services, commodities, so on. While that's great, and there's a lot of folks who were very, very concerned about the fact that US investment was going into entity listed companies, it's super important to note that there's no law right now that says that you can't invest in a company that's on the entity list. Export controls do not deal with the flow of money. They deal with the flow of goods and services and software, technology, so on. So this seems, recommendation 4 seems like a kind of low-hanging fruit way for us to think about tackling some of the kind of most egregious examples while we figure out things that are more complicated. The last thing I'll say really quickly on number 4 too is that it will be super important to keep the jurisdiction of each of these lists in mind when deciding to cross-list things. There will be certain cases where a company deserves to be on the entity list, but isn't well suited to go on the CMIC list. So we have to really kind of make sure that, we're not just cross-listing things for the purpose of cross-listing things, but we're cross-listing them because they fit within the authorities and the jurisdiction of each of the various lists. And happy to talk about examples of those in the Q&A. But with that, thank you all so much for coming. and we look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Oh. Wow, that was a lot of information to digest, and congratulations again on kind of wading through all of that data and helping provide some clarity on the types of transactions that are happening. We are going to move into the Q&A portion. If you are joining us virtually, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring those. If you are here in the room, of course, feel free to raise your hand and we will call on you. I will kick us off with one bigger picture question. We're talking a lot in the weeds and on the data, and that's all really important to orient us to what is the actual problem we're trying to solve. I actually want to take us back up to the strategic level first, to think about, I mean, clearly the implication of your report is not necessarily that all of these sorts of investments should be banned. It's important to note, as you have, that the investments that we're talking about in the report, they were legal investments. They were permitted under US law and policy. And so when we think about moving forward, there's a lot of distance between allowing all of this and banning all of this. At the same time, we don't actually have a working definition of what is AI that matters for national security, that is controllable. How would you go about starting to define that universe of AI that we actually think does present a national security risk and where investors do need to start thinking twice?
So I think our TINA taxonomy that we showed earlier that tried to lay out those subsectors of AI is a start. But the more I looked at it, the more I came to the conclusion that it is really hard to decide to ban something purely based on AI itself. I think, again, because of the dual use nature of AI, it would be really hard to craft an actual regime or review that focused on everything in AI. I think it would be capturing too much. And that's why I think something like a notification regime or a data collection program would hopefully get us to the point where, you know, we could start with something broad in terms of data collection. Because again, where, you know, we could tell US companies, look, no one has said you've done anything illegal. We are trying to gain more insight into what is happening here. So you kind of cast a wide net to start. And from there, you're able to then look and see, okay, what are the problematic end uses? I'm going to go back to the export control lingo. What are the problematic end uses of the technologies, of the AI technologies that US investors are investing in? Who are the entities that US investors in AI are investing in? So again, do you have examples or do we find examples in this data collection process of kind of a direct relationship between a Chinese AI investee that received investment from a US company that is then directly turning that around and handing it over to the PLA? So that to me is something that, again, it takes a little more data collection. It would then take data analysis too. We can't just, get a stack of data and try to just, throw it into a computer and say, we're done, we have the data. It's going to take a lot of analytical process too on the part of the US government. But that to me is how we start to really parse out where we need an actual review regime, or, where we maybe, things are maybe not as bad as we think they are.
Yeah, and I'll add that to Emily's point that it's really difficult to kind of bucket all these companies by their AI-ness, and we try to do that, right? Like we have a way to identify AI companies, and as we point out in the report and also the presentation, that AI is not a singular industry, right? It spans across applications, it spans across sectors, so it's really important for us to proceed very cautiously to make sure that we don't really isolate companies that are developing AI applications for to improve, like, say, medicines or agricultural use, or even like sales and other usage. And I'll say this as well, that AI is a technology. It's foundational for a lot of things. And as he said, we take a look at biotech and even at the intersection of AI and cybersecurity as well. So there's a lot of places that we can unpack. And the first step is to really have a better understanding of this. And we tried really hard in this report to list examples and potential ways that could be problematic, you may say.
Excellent. I'm going to go to some questions that we're getting from our audience virtually. But folks in the room, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to chime in. A question from Adina. Is it by design that China's AI companies are dominated by Chinese investment? For example, are the regulations that create barriers to entry for foreign investors in the AI sector?
Short answer is no. And if you look really closely at the China's 2017 AI next generation AI development plan, came out published by the State Council. There's a particular section that talks about, the plan is calling for more investment coming from the angel investment, risk based investment. They basically just want more investment, even from foreign investors as well. And additionally, the venture capital space in China is pretty new. So they gain a lot of benefits from U.S. Venture capital firms being present there and guiding and offering, capital and mentorship that we already discussed. So there's a lot of needs for foreign activities in the region. So I would say I haven't really seen any particular regulation that says no more foreign investment. So.
The only thing I'd add to that quickly is just, I know I could see this question coming at the point of some of the conversations that have come out around certain regulations on the part of the Chinese government when a foreign company invests in, a company in China or in joint ventures. I think AI and some of these emerging technology areas are a bit unique in that sense, where at this point, the Chinese government is looking for money from anywhere. Particularly when that policy came out in 2017, they were actively looking for investment from everyone, most likely from the US, partly because of the potential intangible benefits that might come with that money. So to say, again, I don't think it's necessarily by design that the majority of the investment in Chinese AI companies is coming from domestic Chinese investors. But I will say, and I don't think we covered this yet, but the top two investors in Chinese AI companies globally, the top one is Sequoia Capital China. So it is the China-based affiliate of a US company. Number two is a company called Gen Fund, which was established with a local education software company in conjunction with Sequoia Capital China. And those are the top two global investors in Chinese AI companies. So we could talk about the intangible benefits that the Chinese AI companies get, but there's a whole separate conversation that was beyond the scope of this report that talks about the intangible benefits from the US that have helped to build up China's AI, China's VC industry itself. So interesting kind of connection there too.
Excellent. We'll go to a question in the room.
I'm Maria Sinclair. I'm a fellow with the energy team at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and also a 3L at Georgetown Law. I'm curious about something that you mentioned, Emily, about the sort of direct competitor framework. And I'm wondering if you guys were able to sort of generate any data on that, on what these PE and other funding organizations were doing in the US at the same time that they were funding potential competitors in China. Thanks.
So you are not the first person to follow up with us about that question. And I will say CSET has done some great research in the past looking at global trends in AI investment around the world. We are currently trying to think about doing an update to that project that will, I think, hopefully put the findings that Nora and I have in this paper in a more solid context. So,
yep, more to come.
Yes.
A question from online, Nomsa, have you measured political will or appetite for these recommendations? And I'm actually going to add a wrinkle to that. Let's talk about political will and appetite in the United States, and then of course with partners and allies too, which is always part of the conversation when we talk about these economic security measures, much more effective if we're not doing it alone. So over to you.
Yeah, I can start on the US side, and Nora is much better suited to talk about allies and partners. So for the most part, there's a lot of excitement in the US about any type of outbound investment review, regime, policy, both coming from the Biden administration as well as in Congress. On the Hill side, Senator Cornyn from Texas has been very concerned about the outbound investment conversation since back when FIRMA was under debate. So he has been very dedicated to this issue for a while, and he, along with Senator Casey, from Pennsylvania have been kind of spearheading this effort, at least on the Senate side. Theirs tends to be a little more focused on the supply chain resiliency perspective, but I think there's kind of a balance now where both the executive and Congress are trying to see who is going to move first on it. So it's not a matter of, do we want this? Do we need this? I think there's an understanding that everyone wants to tackle this issue. It's now about how we tackle it and how we do it.
Yeah, and on the allied side, I mean, obviously, like similar to export controls as well, we can't do this alone. If we were to do it, there are opportunities where, other countries, foreign investors can backfill. And you can clearly see that in the figure, very beautiful figure that we put together for the slide, that there are definitely gaps that other countries can fill in. So we have to be in conversations with allies and partners. And separately from this report, CSET also has looked at the AI investment tides between the Quad countries. And we did see that that the Australia, India, and Japan, each of them have stronger investment ties with the US in the AI space than with each other, right? So there is a lot more opportunities there as well to kind of increase more collaboration across all these countries. And interestingly, they also have more investment ties with China, right? So if there is a way for us to get all of us to be on the same page and share information about what we're finding here and take this potential risk that you may name it, to our allies and partners and say, this is an area where we are concerned about, right, to get them on board. Another thing I'll say is that a lot of countries do not have any conversation about investment currently. Some of them don't even have the inbound investment screening review. So I think at this point, there are 35 countries that have inbound investment, some sort of regime. So there needs to be conversation first about, concerns over investment that are coming to their countries before there's conversation, about the capital flowing out. Same way that we've done here with CFIUS back in 2018. So it's going to be a long way to go for us to get allies and partners to be on board. But now is the time to start.
Excellent. We'll go to a few questions in the room. I see purple sweater in the back. Go ahead and state your name and affiliation before you ask the question.
Hi, yeah, I'm Helen Toner. I'm here at CSET. Hi, Emily and Ngor. Great presentation, and Emily, thanks. Question for you both. You mentioned as one of your key findings that the U.S. doesn't have the data that it would need or the kind of ability to monitor in order to effectively restrict these investments. And then you also just had the question about the kind of amount of energy that is currently being felt in Congress and the executive branch. So I'd be really curious for you to elaborate on if, hypothetically, there were a feeling of, well, we're going to turn the tap off, gosh darn it, no matter what, whether we're ready or not. What would you see as the ways that would go wrong, or what would be your concerns with kind of charging ahead, even if the data is not available?
So the biggest thing that worries me is casting way too broad of a net. I worry that either Congress or the executive, whoever decides to move first, if they don't go and try to collect the data first, they will potentially aim it at, for instance, all of AI, which we've already established would be very problematic for a whole host of reasons. Not to mention the fact that it's really hard. The companies don't necessarily call themselves AI companies. So from the U.S. government perspective too, if you want to turn off all investment into AI companies, first the U.S. government has to decide what is an AI company. CSET has tried to do that too, but it was not the easiest process. So the U.S. government would have to come up with its own definitions for AI, and there are so many different ways that could potentially go wrong or be skewed in certain ways. So that's that's at least my concern with AI in particular. I think the other concern on my end too is I think there is an element of soft power in allowing some amount of U.S. investment to continue going over to China in places where things maybe aren't, where we can decide that things maybe aren't as risky. I think, for instance, in certain types of, I'm thinking of that TINA chart again, certain types of AI education software, obviously, as long as it's not teaching, Xi Jinping thought or something like that scary app that was in the news a few years ago. I don't necessarily hate the idea of US company investing in an AI education software company in China. I think there's something, I don't know, I think there's something powerful about that. So thinking about also ways, thinking about the soft power element of it too. The last thing I'll say, and I'll let Nor add something, is if we decide to tomorrow turn off all US investment into Chinese AI companies, we also lose the ability to actually understand what is happening in China. We lose that information. We lose that kind of on the ground knowledge that US investors and US companies have received over the past 20, 25 years at this point. And as soon as you lose that type of insider knowledge, it makes it really hard to know what's going on going forward. And, you know, obviously I would prefer for the trajectory of US-China relations to go up rather than down, or go more positive than negative. I have no control over that. So, you know, if things were to, you know, get worse over the next few years, losing access to that on the ground knowledge, I think would put us, would really hamper our abilities to watch what's going on.
Yeah, and I'll add that there are definitely unintended consequences that I'm terrified of. And one of the things that Emily just mentioned is, you know, there are definitely knowledge and, you know, investment is a two-way street, right? There are benefits both sides. And so that is going to cut us off from what we've been, you know, us research and also like US policymakers have understanding of China. And also say this, that I'm worried about the potential adverse effect that could potentially come out from this. You know, we can lose competitiveness or competitive edge if we were to blindly put together, you know, something that we don't have an understanding of, right? So I'm talking about industry actors who might be scared away from, you know, or potentially in the future, not even considering China as an option. And again, there are benefits, capital benefits and other things. So we have to really proceed cautiously before moving forward.
Thank you. And as a former government bureaucrat, I would be remiss not to point out the administrative issues associated with too large of a regime. These things are complicated. They take a lot of staffing and institutional processes and resources to stand up and do well. And so that is an important part of how we think about this, as well as do we actually have the capacity to implement it and enforce it effectively. We are almost at time. We've got actually a good amount of questions still coming in from online and perhaps in the room. So we are going to tip a little bit over to past 5 o'clock. But perhaps we can do a little bit of rapid fire to try to get to as many of these as possible here. We have a few questions from the virtual audience talking about private sector reactions. So I'm just going to bundle these together. Kind of, to what extent have you gotten feedback from the private sector about the recommendations or the data? How do we think they will respond? And of course, how can the government work with private sector to really try to scope this in a way that does meet both national security objectives, economic competitiveness objectives, and kind of keeps the private sector operating kind of as a well-oiled machine?
So I would just say quickly, and I can understand obviously concerns coming from the private sector about what a potential outbound investment regime might look like and how it might affect their bottom line. I think that that's completely fair, particularly given a lot of the rhetoric that's been going around about this policy. What I would say is that there are significant benefits to the private sector in working with US government to craft this policy in a way that is narrowly scoped and is still effective. So I'm thinking, again, similarly along the lines of in the export control community, where the Department of Commerce has things like these technical advisory committees where they bring in folks in specific, very high tech sectors or communities and talk to them about, you know, export controls going forward. Could we actually control this? If we write the regulation this way, how would this affect your industry? Things like that. So even doing something like that with industry as we go through the process of developing some type of outbound investment regime, I think would be really helpful. And it would hopefully give the government the opportunity to quell some of the fears of folks in the private sector. Because I do genuinely believe that the US government is not interested in killing US companies. I don't think that's the case. And I think at least the folks that we've talked to in US government really understand the importance of keeping our companies really competitive in this space. So because of that, I think, if I can encourage folks in the private sector to not totally shy away from this and be willing to have these conversations and be honest about the things they are concerned about, I think that would really help folks in Congress and in the White House think about where to take this.
One more question from the virtual audience, which is, what other sectors should we be concerned about? Obviously, the report focused on AI, so there's a good database to work from there, or at least a beginning of a database with more data to come. We've heard, obviously, indications that the administration is worried about chips and quantum. Where else is this going?
Yeah, no, we need to think about what else we need to take a look at closer. But I think chips is definitely, and it's sometimes covered in the report as well. Semiconductor is also, or computing power is one of the fundamental components to make an algorithm or to make machine learning. So that is really important for us to think about as well. But again, for this particular report, we only look at one particular technology. So it's next step could potentially be, could be applied to other technologies as well. So it's an experiment.
And I would say I defer to the administration and Congress here to decide what to prioritize. I mean, I know we could go back to things that Jake Sullivan has said, where he's talked again about quantum, like Ngor said, biotech. Obviously, biotech is huge. And, we work very closely with our biotech team here at CSET. And I've been told that, there's ecological biotech, there's medical biotech. So I don't even want to touch how you would even begin to define biotech for the purposes of an outbound investment regime. But there are folks who are experts who can do that. So we defer to them. And I would just say I hope that we, in putting out this report, have given folks kind of a methodological foundation upon which they could maybe do their own version of this in different sectors.
Thank you. Any final questions in the room? Or yes, blue sweater. Good.
Hey, Matt Schrader at IRI. I just have one question about the sort of differentiated monitoring regime that you guys are gesturing towards as the recommendations. So like the administration right now is saying in the field of semiconductors, we think we're going to maintain a quantitative edge because the technology is so inherently dual use that we just want to maintain the US edge, regardless of whatever the end use or end application of the technology is. So if you were making a case to the administration that AI should be sort of treated differently from the semiconductors, that it shouldn't be a case of maintaining a quantitative edge across all potential applications, but trying to figure out which ones are problematic and targeting those. How would you make that case to the administration? How would you argue that these two things are distinct, or what are the reasons that they should be treated differently?
A very easy question to end things with. No, it's a really important question. And the kind of the first thing that comes to mind for me is the fact that AI is bigger than chips. You could argue again, both are very foundational technologies. There are intricacies, within subsectors of semiconductors that have more relevant military applications than others. There are some that are more dual use. Again, the same arguments we're seeing with artificial intelligence. But my off the cuff kind of assumption here is that it is probably a lot easier also to identify aspects of the semiconductor supply chain than it would be to build out something on the artificial intelligence supply chain. I don't even know how you would go about doing that. And because you can't do that, I think it would be really hard to just take this broad brush, we're going to stay 2 generations ahead type of thing. Because you'd have to figure out, we want to stay 2 generations ahead in what? In computing, cloud computing, sensors, robotics, natural language processing. Like there are so many different pieces of it. So I think it would be just impossible.
And lastly, Emily's point about AI being a bigger category. I'll flag this report by Ben Buchanan, AI Triad, that talks about 3 different components. So we have computing power, algorithms, and data, which are all important for any machine learning development. So you need all these components, but semiconductor is part of it. So cast a wire net.
All right, last question to wrap us up here. And I'm going to take, again, Marty's prerogative to ask the last question. What does success look like? If we're 5 years, 10 years down the road, we've stood up something, we've gotten the data, what do we want that relationship to look like in terms of the investment flows? How do we know if this is working?
So for me, success would look like, well, let me first say what success would not look like. I don't think that with any type of outbound investment regime, and Nor and I talked about this in the paper, I don't think we can assume that it will cripple Chinese companies. I don't think it will halt China's progress in AI at all. What I hope is that, what does success look like? Success looks like us making it more difficult for China to advance in artificial intelligence by making it more costly for them to do so. Costly in terms of, let's say they can no longer get US dollars in specific aspects of artificial intelligence. So the Chinese government or Chinese domestic investors have to pour that money in themselves, or they have to go about taking the time to find other investors. So again, we're imposing cost, we're imposing time, we're imposing all of these different kind of roadblocks. I know people kind of joke about it's like the like pouring marbles out with a car coming, and you're hoping that the car, that was a horrible metaphor. I hope people know what I'm talking about here. Doing something like that involves, again, just making it as difficult for China to advance in those clear, those policy objectives, those areas that we're really concerned about. So hopefully 5-10 years from now, we'd see them not making the same advances that, or at least the trajectory would be slowing down.
All right, the marbles doctrine, heard it here first. Nora, any last words?
Yeah, I mean, and also, to add to Emily's excellent points already, there are definitely areas that we are concerned of, like human rights and, China's ability to surveil its own population. So being able to block that kind of technology that's going to terrible usage for, this kind of things is also really important for us. So that is also one indicator of success for me.
Excellent. Well, again, Emily and Nora, congratulations on the report. I will return it back over to Lynn to close us out here. Thanks to everyone for participating in this really fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Emily Kilcrease. Thanks, everybody. Emily Kilcrease, capable and wonderful moderator. You're welcome back to Georgetown and to CSET anytime. And thanks also to Emily Weinstein and Ngor Luong. Congratulations on the release of your report and its widespread dissemination in the media, as well as we've seen some interest on Capitol Hill in some follow-up. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us today, both here and online. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. There were some really good ones still in the queue. And maybe if you want to talk with the authors after this, if you're in the room, that would be great. And if you'd like to get in touch with them, CSET does have an inbox and the email address is on our website. If you want to know more about CSET overall, please go to cset.georgetown.edu. And also while you're there, check out our newsletter and our research updates, and you can sign up for those. Our next webinar will take place on March 30th, and it will focus on a recently published CSET paper by John Verwey about strategically crucial supply chains, the CHIPS and Science Act, and how the tax credits and other incentives therein can be leveraged to truly secure US and allied access to microelectronics. Like that paper itself, we're calling this special event, both online and in person, Betting the House. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.